That man's name was David Vance, and he worked at Area 51. It was not a nickname, a cover story, or some top-secret sounding term used to describe an ordinary military base. He was speaking of a real location, a place that humanity has whispered about for decades, where the truth of the Roswell incident was buried. It is a place forever linked to encounters with strange objects and stories of things in the sky that did not move in any way a human aircraft could. Through David's harrowing memories, every rumor was proven true. The crash at Roswell in 1947 actually happened. His organization recovered materials from that crash, and they also brought back bodies that were entirely non-human. And that person is me, David Vance, borrowing these lines to recount for you the darkest corners of this place. That when you hear about working at a top-secret base, perhaps images immediately come to mind of brilliant researchers in pristine white coats, punched over complex computer screens, or in state-of-the-art sterile labs to dissect technology ahead of its time. But the reality is quite different. I was not a researcher in a white coat. My actual role was that of a cleaner, one who cordons off and moves those gruesome remains. If something leaked, if a door was breached, or if an anomalous seed accidentally slipped out of control, our team would be the first ones pushed toward death to clean the scene and bring those disgusting things to safety before they could spread destruction. My job was to imprison things that did not belong to this world, things that were never meant to see the light of the sun. That you see, everything the public or the media sees of this base, the runway stretching across the arid desert, the boring administrative buildings, or the giant radar stations occasionally caught by orbiting satellites, is all just a perfect facade. It exposes the lie of the surface area compared to what is truly happening beneath the ground. That surface is entirely hollow and harmless, with nothing worth concerning oneself over beyond ordinary flight tests. But the horrifying truth, the murky and rancid core of this place, lies deep below that barren earth and stone. Beneath our feet is a massive network, a closed underground city dug deep into the ends of darkness, where natural light can never reach. Down there, they hide secrets that could collapse every belief held by humanity. Giant hangars housing intact machines without a single seam, and frozen rooms containing twisted forms with body proportions entirely skewed from any creature that has ever existed on Earth. There are machines torn open from the inside as if something tried to escape at the last moment, and bodies with anatomical structures that defy every biological law we were ever taught. That I once walked those suffocating hallways, breathing in the freezing artificial air and wondering how many people like me had been left forever in these depths just to protect a grand lie. Every day starting a shift was a step into a pre-dug grave, where the boundary between life, death, and things far beyond human understanding was as thin as a single breath. To set foot into that deep hell, you had to pass through a multi-layered security system so rigorous it seemed designed to separate the human world from the abyss below. It began at the outer checkpoints with heavy armed patrols and continued through internal security scans so thorough they seemed to want to strip away your very soul. Before entering the main elevator car, all personal belongings, from phones to watches, were confiscated to create absolute isolation. They allowed nothing not issued by the facility to slip below, forcing you to shed your existence in the real world to become a nameless shadow. And then, the real journey began when the metal doors of the massive elevator closed, bringing a suffocating sensation during the descent into the deep, soul-crushing work environment. It was a slow free fall into the pitch-black earth with no opening or window to hold on to, only the rhythmic groan of machinery echoing against your eardrums. When the doors opened at the bottom floor, what greeted you were always steel-clad hallways and surveillance cameras everywhere, like eerie eyes that never blinked, silently watching our every breath. Even the air we breathed into our lungs each day felt wrong, because it was filtered so clean it possessed no flavor. It was a sterile, bland air that left your lungs feeling empty and overwhelmed, a constant reminder that you were completely severed from the natural life above. That I still shiver whenever I unearth the memory of my first day working in that dark place where terrible secrets are buried. I was thrown into a suffocating environment filled with anomalous dangers beyond understanding, yet there was no formal training or instructor to explain what we were actually facing. There were no long orientation speeches or thick safety manuals like in the world above. Instead, I was simply issued a soulless identification card and a slip of paper containing 5 life or death rules. That thin white paper sat in the palm of my hand, containing requirements so bizarre and mechanical that I initially thought it was a cruel joke played on a newcomer. But when I looked up at the manager seeking a knowing smile or a clearer explanation, all I received was a cruelly rigid face. He looked straight through me with the empty eyes of a man who had witnessed too much death, and then he uttered the only chilling warning from the taskmaster, growling each word. Slowly follow them, exactly to the letter. There was no opportunity for me to ask questions and no mercy for the curious. I was left alone in the spine-chilling silence of the underground tunnels, dimly aware that from this moment on, my life depended entirely on absolute compliance with those 5 insane principles printed on that small piece of paper. It did not take long for me to truly understand the weight of that ruthless warning when I saw with my own eyes the cruel reality strike those who accidentally or intentionally violated the rules. In the world above, a mistake might cost you your job, but down in this dark bottom, even the smallest error would completely strip away your existence. Utter panic began to invade my mind whenever I walked along the cold steel corridors. Witnessing boundary doors suddenly slammed shut, locking away unlucky souls inside forever, with no one permitted to open them or intervene to help. A chill ran down my spine as I realized that colleagues I had stood beside just hours before had suddenly evaporated from the real world. They were erased, vanished from the personnel system before the shift even ended, without any investigation, report, or explanation from the organization, as if they had never been born. It was the haunting silence of such a cold-blooded and unfeeling management system that sowed the seeds of terror deep in my soul. A stifling fear began to take shape, rooting itself in every thought and choking my lungs every time I had to breathe that bland, sterile air. I began to withdraw into myself, trembling at the smallest sound in the dark corners, and always telling myself to obey every word on that cruel paper like a fanatic, forcing myself to be a mindless machine just for the slim chance of surviving to return to the surface. The most horrific nightmare began to shatter my last bit of reason on the night I truly understood the meaning of the first rule, a line of text that seemed innocuous on paper but carried the most brutal death sentence. That rule stated clearly that if something bleeds blue, press the emergency lockdown button immediately. When I first read those words on my first day, I naively thought it was just a standard protocol for preventing chemical infection, something that could be handled if we wore enough protective gear, moved fast enough, and followed procedure. But I was wrong, miserably wrong, until I saw it happen with my own eyes during an exhausting night shift in my 3rd week at the underground loading department. At that night, my colleague Marcus Thorne and I were tasked with very carefully moving a container that had just been brought back from some secret recovery site in the remote desert. The container was nearly 3 meters long, without any markings or labels except for a series of faded numbers embossed on the side. The material wrapping its exterior was an eerie, dull black. It did not look like metal or synthetic plastic, but rather seemed to absorb all light hitting it, creating a soft, unsettling feeling under the flickering, dim fluorescent lights on the reinforced concrete ceiling. Marcus was a seasoned man, a man of few words who always worked mechanically and with great certainty, the kind of calm person you never worried about being assigned to during those long, dragging shifts that we were struggling to coordinate lifting that black box from the transport rack down to the floor when the object inside suddenly shifted. It was nothing too significant, just an unexpected slip of the hand because the center of gravity in the box seemed uneven, causing it to tilt slightly. Marcus immediately reacted by stepping forward, reaching out his gloved hand to catch the edge of the box, trying to use his body weight to guide it back to a balanced position. But at the very moment his fingers touched that black surface, a sharp edge that had not existed when we first checked the safety latches suddenly protruded and cut a clean line through Marcus' glove. It was not a gaping wound, nor did it tear through the thick protective fabric entirely, but it was just sharp enough to rip the surface and create a thin scratch on his flesh. Marcus let out a hiss and pulled his hand back immediately, muttering a frustrated curse at his own carelessness, not yet realizing that the boundary of death had been crossed. Small cuts or abrasions like that were supposed to be common occurrences in this earthly hell where all materials and machines were jagged, cold, and did not follow familiar physical laws. Initially, both he and I assumed it was just a trivial workplace accident, until Marcus slowly lowered his head to stare at his hand. In that instant, the air around us seemed to freeze, marking the moment every definition of life on this earth was completely crushed. At first, I thought the flickering lights on the ceiling had deceived my vision, but a total horror gripped my chest when I realized the blood seeping from Marcus' hand was not the familiar deep red. Instead, a thick liquid, heavy like machine oil and bearing an eerie, dark forest green color, was flowing slowly along his fingers. The entire room fell into a deathly silence. Marcus did not scream or show any alarm regarding the wound. His psychological transformation happened with a speed that was bone-chilling as he completely lost the basic emotions of a normal human being. The earlier frustration vanished without a trace, his face smoothed out, and he began to smile in a bizarre way, a distorted grin that appeared too late as if someone had clumsily stitched it onto his body. His eyes drifted over me blankly as if he were studying a strange creature, and then he spoke in a cold voice, asking meaningless and disconnected questions like whose shift this was or demanding to know my name, even though we had worked together for weeks. Watching those heavy drops of slimy green liquid fall one by one onto the concrete floor, a bolt of realization struck my mind, reminding me of the disgusting nature of the first rule. I realized that the thing standing before me was no longer my dedicated colleague. That creature was gradually seizing and replacing Marcus. Survival instinct rose up to overwhelm all hesitation. I did not wait another second. I turned in a panic, running like a madman toward the wall and slamming my hand into the bright red emergency lockdown button. At the moment my hand struck that red button, a deafening alarm tore through my eardrums, and instantly, the entire steel plating system slammed down, imprisoning us all in a tight, enclosed space. Giant steel doors dropped from the ceiling as fast as guillotines, completely sealing off all escape exits and changing the air circulation to a murderous red glow. While I was trembling and backing into the corner, a side door burst open just enough for a security team to appear like soulless machines. They rushed in with heavy weapons already cocked, their gear completely sealed, moving with a speed that was non-human. There was no warning, no question about the situation, and no risk assessment. They immediately opened fire, executing Marcus in cold blood without the slightest hesitation. The deafening explosions echoed painfully. The body of the colleague who had once stood by me collapsed onto the cold concrete floor without resistance, sinking into a pool of thick green fluid. The cleanup process was unbelievably swift. As soon as the armed team retreated, another group stepped in to remove the corpse, scrubbing every inch of the floor and taking away that eerie black container. When the shift ended, the room was empty again, returned to its original state as if no murder had ever occurred. Most terrifyingly, Marcus Thorne's records vanished from the base that very night. His name was wiped from every schedule and every personnel data system, stripping away every trace of a flesh-and-blood human being. It was so ruthless and thorough that it was as if His existence had been nothing but a fevered dream of my own. After that night of witnessing Marcus' existence being completely erased from the world, my mind became even more fractured, but the ruthless gears of the underground organization never stopped turning. That absolute fear led me to the next bone-chilling experience tied to rule number 2 written on that fateful paper: absolutely never enter a recovered vessel if it suddenly powers itself on. Most of the machines kept down here lay as silent as dead blocks of metal, and the ship in hangar number 3 was no exception. The atmosphere in that area was always shrouded in a bone-deep chill. The ceiling was so high it cast shadows over a massive machine shaped like a flattened oval, its surface smooth, gray, and devoid of any visible doors, entrances, or mechanical seams. It had sat there for years, silent and cold, making it easy for one to foster the illusion that it was harmless as long as it was strictly controlled. That day, I was assigned to perform a routine check on its structure and energy systems, alongside a new colleague, a young technician named Samuel Becker. The vast space of the hangar only echoed with the monotonous beeps of measuring devices. Neither of us imagined that this artificial silence was the perfect trap to awaken an entity that did not belong to the human world. Just as I was busy recording the final tedious data points, the world around us seemed to stop breathing as the ship suddenly emitted a soft blue light from within, despite not being connected to any power source. That light was not blinding but rather glowed from the very material of the machine, rhythmic and slow like a heartbeat rising from the grave. Amidst that perfectly smooth metal surface, a gap automatically separated with an eeriness that made one's skin crawl, producing no sound of friction or mechanical movement. Inside was only a space filled with faint blue light, empty and hazy, with no shadows or visible structures, yet it radiated a hauntingly strange attraction. In the moment my mind was paralyzed by a horror that choked my throat, screaming to remind me of that cruel prohibition. My young colleague standing next to me completely lost his reason. Unlike my panic, Samuel was hypnotized by curiosity, his eyes fixed blankly on that anomalous light like a moth yearning to dive into a flame. I tried to reach out, tried to shout an order for him to stop, but all efforts were futile as he completely ignored the ban and began walking toward the opening with steps that were soulless yet determined. That the quiet air of the hangar now felt distorted. Each of his footsteps echoed hollowly on the concrete floor, pulling the poor young man toward a deadly trap that no power in this dark hell could prevent. I stood staring as his feet slowly crossed that invisible boundary, my heart pounding in my chest as if it would burst. As soon as Samuel stepped fully into that overwhelming blue light, the metal hole seemed to become translucent, allowing me to see his silhouette standing a few paces away. From my perspective, there was no creature or figure present inside, only a smooth floor and that haunting light. Yet Samuel suddenly smiled and waved at something invisible in that strange, empty space. That he murmured something I could not hear clearly and then nodded in obedient agreement. Despite my shouts of protest that echoed until my throat was raw, Samuel coldly ignored me, calmly stepping deeper into that ghostly space before suddenly vanishing completely into thin air right before my eyes. Without a sound or a flash, he simply no longer existed there, like a speck of dust swallowed by the massive machine into another dimension. A few seconds of silence passed, and the ship completely closed its smooth surface and went dark, returning the vast hangar to cold shadows. The armed security team immediately swarmed the area, scanning the machine inside and out for over an hour, but they found absolutely no biological trace left behind. And like a cold-blooded script already programmed, no report or investigation took place. Samuel's life was thoroughly erased by the organization immediately after. His name tag was deactivated before my shift even ended, turning a young man who had been laughing with me minutes before into a nameless shadow that had never existed on this earth. Following Samuel's permanent evaporation, the suffocating darkness of the underground area weighed even heavier on my mind, reminding me of the gruesome presence of rule number 3 written on that thin paper: absolutely must spray a fire extinguisher at any black stain that appears in the hallway. The horrifying nature of this rule revealed itself on a long, dragging night amidst the exhausted and thick atmosphere of a 2 o'clock morning shift. At that time, I was pushing an empty cargo cart along a damp and cold transit tunnel, counting every second until I could enter the elevator to return to the surface. Suddenly, my footsteps faltered as I accidentally discovered a streak of black liquid, as thick as motor oil, seeping from the base of the wall and pooling on the rough concrete floor. Initially, I felt only a tired irritation, assuming some cleaning crew had been careless and spilled chemicals or engine coolant in the path. But as I started to move closer, that thick black streak suddenly vibrated violently. An utter horror struck my remaining bit of reason when I saw with my own eyes that the slimy liquid was not inanimate. It seemed to have awareness, automatically slithering like a living creature and slowly spreading toward the metal drainage grate in the middle of the hallway. The purposeful and silent movement of something that should have been inorganic waste made my whole body go cold, turning the underground space into a cruel trap waiting to explode under my boots. In the split second I recoiled in terror, the true nature of that black liquid began to reveal itself in the most vivid and brutal way. Intense heat blasted directly into my face, a dry heat smelling of burnt metal, proving that the waste was not being burned by an external fire but was generating immense heat from within its own slimy form. Just as I hurriedly reached to grab the fire extinguisher hanging on the wall as a survival reflex, hollow footsteps echoed from around the corner, and maintenance worker Arthur Briggs appeared with his usual grumpy face. Despite my screams of warning for him to get back immediately, the deadly curiosity of the underground hell rose up, prompting Arthur to ignore all danger and foolishly approach the black stain that was constantly expanding. Just as his boots were only a few steps from that dark quagmire, the edge of the black stain reached out and touched the steel mesh surface of the drain cover. A sharp sizzling sound erupted along with a cloud of white smoke, and before our wide, horrified eyes, that ghostly liquid began to glow red and then melted those thick metal bars with a dizzying speed, preparing a path for an irreversible disaster in that suffocating hallway. As the sturdy steel bars of the grate warped and bent under the terrifying heat, a portion of that thick, slimy black liquid quickly slipped through the gap and slid down into the murky drain beneath the concrete surface. In less than 3 seconds, a series of sharp clattering sounds echoed from deep within the core of the walls, sounding exactly like a massive machine operating at full capacity being stuffed into a box too small for it. That evil liquid, when imprisoned in a closed metal space, seemed to become even more violently agitated. It increased its thermal pressure at an irrational speed, causing the entire floor beneath our feet to vibrate. Rolling heat rose up through the concrete layers, charring a large section of the wall before a deafening explosion tore through the thick air of the hallway. The entire underground pipe system on the left wall burst outward, followed by a screaming blast of steam and a rain of pitch-black death shooting into the cramped space. Arthur Briggs, the unfortunate man with the deadly curiosity, was standing too close and had no chance to react, taking the full force of the heat-generating liquid directly against the left half of his body. The destruction did not happen like instant acid erosion in science fiction movies. It was tens of thousands of times more cruel and painful. As soon as that slimy black mud clung to his coveralls, it seemed to focus all its immense heat on those points of contact, causing the protective fabric to darken and then smolder with a dull, orange light. Arthur collapsed to the floor, rolling frantically and emitting savage screams, cries so agonizing they tore at the eardrums, filled with a primal pain as his flesh was being roasted alive under his sizzling clothes. The smell of burnt fabric, scorched meat, and a sickeningly sweet, nauseating odor hit my nose, nearly making me vomit, but survival instinct urged me to yank the safety pin of the fire extinguisher. I rushed forward, ignoring the heat slapping my face, frantically squeezing the trigger and spraying a torrent of white foam onto Arthur's convulsing body and the floor that was boiling and hissing. As the fire-suppressing chemicals poured out, covering the black quagmire, I bitterly realized the truth about rule number 3: the fire extinguisher could not actually put this thing out. The cold foam only caused the edges of the black streak to thicken, reducing its gloss and preventing it from continuing to generate heat and spread. Or more accurately, it only helped me buy desperate time before the security alarm system could activate. Beams of bright red light swept back and forth along the hallway, the siren wailed piercingly, and massive steel plates dropped to seal the entire area in an instant. Shortly after, the containment team appeared in heavy heat-resistant suits, carrying foam cannons and specialized equipment to suppress the remainder of the strange liquid trapped in the pipes. One of them roughly dragged Arthur out of the danger zone. By then, he was only a soulless shell, gasping in ragged breaths with half of his body completely deformed under layers of scorched cloth fused to his skin. Much later, through whispers and rumors shared during rare breaks, I learned that Arthur actually survived that horrific night. That I saw him one single time at the internal medical wing, wrapped entirely in white bandages from his shoulder down to his hip, his face haggard and aged by 20 years, with eyes that were permanently hollow and fixed on the blank wall. After that brief encounter, the organization quietly transferred him somewhere far away, and he disappeared forever from these underground levels. Every trace of his service was erased, leaving me with a haunting obsession about the price one pays for looking too deeply into the darkness. The silent ghosts of unfortunate colleagues like Arthur Briggs or Samuel Becker constantly haunted my fitful sleep, but it seemed the underground organization never allowed us time to mourn, for that fateful paper still held horrific sentences waiting to be carried out. Rule number 4 was the most ruthless boundary, choking every thin hope of survival. That line was printed in cold, bold letters, stating clearly that even a single scratch from an extraterrestrial creature meant death. There were no exceptions, no time for quarantine observation, no antidotes, and no medical measures applied. Once the claws or skin of those non-human entities grazed your body, you had officially stepped through the door of death, and the system would automatically strike your name from the list of the living. This was not a standard infection control procedure like those used in hospitals. On the surface, it was a brutal death sentence handed out on the spot to ensure that an anomalous seed never had a chance to take root. Inhumanity or escape to the outside. That I had once shivered at that prospect in my quiet moments alone, but I could never have imagined that this inhumane law would be the very blade that cut short the life of the person I loved most in the world, marking the greatest turning point of my life. That night was a long, dragging one, suffocatingly quiet. My younger brother Michael and I were dragging a cart along a deserted embankment hallway at the end of our shift. On the surface, this hallway appeared unremarkable and safe. It was just a long, narrow strip of gray concrete with countless pipes running along the ceiling and iron drainage grates scattered on the floor, serving as a barren transit route between two areas housing anomalous entities. It was the most energy-depleted time of the working night. The area was submerged in a deathly silence. There was no mechanical roar from the labs, no hurried footsteps from patrols, only the sound of our cartwheels squealing dryly against the rough floor. The two of us were talking, not about grand subjects or the base's horrifying secrets, but just ordinary, mundane stories, memories of our mother, of a sun-drenched house, and small, normal things from the world above to keep our minds from going insane in this dark prison. Michael walked a little ahead of me, one hand on the cart, occasionally turning to walk backward to tell me a bland joke. His gentle smile seemed to be the only light warming my soul amidst the cold of the steel walls. That we let our guard down, immersed in a rare, false peace, forgetting that at a depth of thousands of meters underground, peace is only a luxury concept used to deceive the unfortunate before death knocks. And then, in the very moment Michael finished speaking, before the smile could even fade from his lips, that false peace was torn apart by a strange, rapid sound coming from the ventilation duct on the ceiling. It was not the hiss of compressed air when the system reversed, nor the scratching of common rodents. It was the sound of metal clashing repeatedly at a speed that was irrationally fast, as if some invisible creature with wild strength was frantically rushing across the ceiling directly toward where we stood. Both of us froze. The cartwheels scraped the floor with a piercing sound and then stopped completely. Our ordinary conversation was choked in our throats as every nerve in my body tightened like a string. My heart skipped a beat and then began pounding frantically in my chest. Michael immediately snapped his head around, his eyes no longer relaxed but filled with extreme alertness, staring straight up at the dark ceiling where that eerie sound grew closer, clearer, and carried a thick aura of bloodlust that seemed to suck the air from around us. It signaled a horrific nightmare about to descend without any mercy. The sound of metal clashing frantically in the ventilation system grew more deafening, dragging down layers of gray dust from decades ago that fell through the air like an omen of death. Michael and I stood paralyzed. All oxygen in my lungs seemed squeezed out as we realized that whatever was moving in that pipe was not a fat rat or a malfunctioning drone, but a living entity carrying a primal frenzy. The iron mesh protecting the vent about 10 paces from us suddenly vibrated violently. Rusted screws groaned and then burst forward under a terrifying force from within. A crashing sound erupted as the heavy metal frame was yanked from the ceiling, slamming into the concrete floor and sending up sparks. Amidst the cloud of dust and flying fragments, a small black shadow saturated with bloodlust shot down like a bullet through the wind. When it hit the ground on all fours, I only dimly recognized its non-human shape. It was not large, perhaps only slightly bigger than a hound, but its entire body structure was grotesquely skewed, with bones bent at impossible angles and a smooth, gray skin that seemed to swallow the dim light of the hallway. But the most horrifying thing, the thing that nailed my feet to the floor and stripped away all ability to resist, were its eyes. They were massive, pitch black, deep, and entirely empty, with no pupils or whites, only a primal cruelty that was soulless and cold to the core. As soon as it touched the ground, its deformed head snapped up, and those non-human eyes locked onto me with precision, completely ignoring Michael's presence nearby. It had chosen me as its prey. Without a growl or a moment's hesitation to gain momentum, the creature coiled and launched itself with a terrifying speed that exceeded every physical law known to man. Its form blurred into a hazy streak in the air, flying just above the ground, aiming its deadly claws straight for my chest. Everything happened so fast, faster than my neurons could signal my muscles to run, and death was only a few inches away. I was like a sleepwalker trapped in a slow-motion nightmare, helplessly waiting for the scythe of death to fall. Yet, in that very life-or-death second, when I had completely surrendered and waited for the darkness to swallow me, Michael was the one who reacted. He was not paralyzed by the extreme fear. The instinct to protect his brother defeated every panic of a normal human. With a supernatural strength activated by courage and blood-bond love, Michael leaned in, kicked off the concrete floor, and threw his entire solid frame in front of me instead of running for cover. He used his full weight to shove me hard, pushing me out of the monster's deadly trajectory. The force was so great I lost my balance, falling backward and slamming my entire shoulder and right ribcage into the rough concrete wall with a dry thud. The stinging pain radiated through my body and my vision wavered, but that violent fall had saved my life from those deadly claws. The grotesque creature missed the spot where I had stood, but its terrifying speed meant it could not stop immediately. Its deadly swipe accidentally intersected the space Michael had just rushed into to save me. A very faint sound, sharp and momentary, echoed in the silent. Sight seemed to be just a chance friction between claw and human skin. The monster did not turn back or stop to continue the attack. It simply used its momentum to land, its hideous legs launching off the floor again as it continued to fly down the length of the hallway, vanishing completely into the thick darkness at the end of the tunnel within seconds. That it left me collapsed at the base of the wall, breathing frantically, my chest heaving as if it would crack. And it left Michael standing frozen in the path. I frantically pushed myself up, shaking off the dizziness to stand, my mouth stammering my brother's name in a wave of relief, thinking we had both luckily escaped death. But the smile had no time to form before it was permanently frozen when I saw that Michael was not turning to look at me. He was slowly backing up a few steps, his face pale under the dim light, his eyes filled with a deep despair fixed on his left arm. There, on the part of his forearm where the protective sleeve had been torn away, was a thin scratch, as slender as a thread but deep, just beginning to ooze drops of bright red blood. It was evidence that he had taken a scratch from that creature to save my life. It was a wound so small it could be ignored anywhere else in the world, but it was a brutal and irreversible death sentence in the hell known as Area 51. Watching that bright red blood drip from Michael's arm, the world around me collapsed completely. That was not just a drop of blood, it was a countdown clock to death, the ruthless and unappealable judgment of rule number 4. I felt as if my chest were being crushed, my breath choking in my throat, and a cold wave ran down my spine, making my whole body shake uncontrollably. The instinct of an older brother urged me to step forward, reaching out with a mad and foolish hope that I could use my shirt to wipe that wound away, that I could use my own life to hide it from the invisible surveillance eyes lurking in every corner of this underground base. "Let me see," I choked out in a broken, hoarse voice, my legs staggering forward like a sleepwalker refusing to accept the cruel reality. But Michael, my brave brother, was completely alert and aware of the ultimate tragedy that had struck his life. He knew the cold-blooded laws of this organization better than anyone. Once you bore the mark of those non-human creatures, no miracle could save you. As soon as he saw me rush toward him, Michael recoiled. His face hardened, his eyes determined and cold enough to make me flinch. "Don't come near," he barked, the volume not loud but sharp as a blade, cutting off all my desperate attempts to intervene. Without letting me react further, Michael turned and used his last bit of strength to run toward the door of the nearest isolation room, numbered C12. He slammed his bloody hand onto the cold metal control panel, his fingers moving expertly to enter the emergency override code from memory. A piercing beep tore through the silence, and the heavy steel door groaned as it slid aside to reveal the sterile, dark space within. Everything happened too fast. I frantically chased after him, screaming my brother's name until my throat was raw, trying to use my own body to wedge into the opening with the desperate intent to drag him back to the hallway. But once again, Michael used the strength of a brother betting his soul to protect his own. He turned at the threshold and delivered a violent shove that sent me tumbling back into the walkway, exactly the same way he had shoved me from the claws of that deadly monster earlier. "Get away now," he roared, his voice filled with a mournful but absolute despair. Immediately, the steel door slid shut and slammed in front of my face with a dry impact that shook my eardrums, separating us into two worlds of life and death. I was like a cornered animal, frantically smashing the external control panel, repeatedly pounding the buttons and entering override codes, but the mindless system only responded with a cold electronic female voice announcing that access was denied. Through the thick, bulletproof glass on the door, I watched in horror and helplessness as Michael made no attempt to escape or resist. He calmly walked across the empty room to the manual control panel on the opposite wall and, without hesitation, pulled down the lever to lock the system from the inside. It was a total lockdown command, cutting off all exits and stripping away the right to intervene from the outside, turning room C12 into a cage where nothing could enter or leave, waiting for death to arrive. At the moment that lever was pulled, the area's automated warning system immediately identified a high-level biological contamination risk. The pale white fluorescent lights went out, replaced by a brilliant and deadly red light that flashed repeatedly, staining the corner of the hallway. At the same time, the heavy solid steel security doors at both ends of the tunnel dropped with deafening thuds, locking me out of freedom and imprisoning Michael inside the death incubator. He slowly leaned his back against the cold steel wall, his breathing beginning to steady after those moments of fighting for life. His gentle eyes, overflowing with love, looked through the thick glass directly at me. He gave a slight shake of his head, a silent gesture that carried the weight of 1,000 pounds, a plea for me to give up the futile effort to break the door. It was a final, agonizing farewell before he left this world forever. That I slid down the steel door, kneeling on the concrete floor, pressing my scratched palms against the glass. Tears streamed down my face, and my throat screamed his name until it bled, but the sound was completely swallowed by the perfect soundproofing of the room. And then, the ultimate physical and mental pain struck when, before my wide, despairing eyes, the thin scratch on Michael's left arm began its horrific transformation. The red blood of a flesh and blood human, the earthly blood shared with me, suddenly stopped flowing. It darkened strangely and then began to transform, mottling like a toxic dye soaking deep into every epidermal cell until it turned completely into a thick, heavy, slimy liquid of that disgusting green color I had seen on Marcus Thorne's hand. The replacement process had officially begun within his body. Every human cell and blood vessel was being ruthlessly devoured and assimilated by the seed of that extraterrestrial entity. That deadly green color was like a gruesome mockery, signaling that the brother I loved most, who had been laughing with me minutes ago, was vanishing from reality. He was being replaced by a brutal alien demon slowly wearing a human skin inside the glass cage of death, leaving me alone to consume the regret and ultimate helplessness of my soul. The most horrific nightmare of my life unfolded behind the cold glass of room C12 as the security team descended on the hallway with a ruthless speed and precision, like programmed killing machines. There were 4 of them, dressed in sealed tactical gear from head to toe, carrying heavy weapons already cocked, bringing no medical equipment or hope for a cure. They stood there, silent and unfeeling, only using cold eyes to scan the green bloodstains spreading on Michael's arm as if inspecting a defective item that needed immediate destruction. No explanation was given, and no evaluation of infection levels occurred, because the presence of that green blood was the ultimate evidence for an irreversible death sentence. That I frantically rushed toward them, screaming until my voice broke, begging them to stop and give Michael a chance, but they ignored me as if I were an invisible ghost. A security officer stepped toward the external panel and nonchalantly pressed the code to activate the emergency incineration system for room C12. Immediately, I heard the roar of the ventilation ducts above Michael's head opening, and a terrifying blast of heat began to be pumped into that cramped space. The temperature inside the room soared at a dizzying speed. I could see the distortion of the air through the glass as waves of heat swallowed the small frame of my brother. David Vance, who had witnessed so many deaths underground, was now forced to helplessly watch my own beloved kin being burned alive. Michael did not scream. He sank to his knees on the floor, his eyes fixed steadily on me until the very last moment, as if to say he did not regret saving my life. I frantically pounded on the glass, using all my strength until my hands bled and my knuckles felt shattered, but all efforts were futile against the reinforced lockdown system. I screamed in total despair as I watched my brother, who had sacrificed himself for me, being roasted to death by the heat. His body gradually collapsed and vanished into the fog of that cruel fire. When the system finally stopped and the air inside cooled, what remained was only a spine-chilling silence and a permanent scar on my soul. Michael was gone, taking a part of my own life into the void, leaving me alone in a hallway glowing with red alarm lights, facing the bitter truth that rule number 4 had stolen everything I cherished. That after the heat in room C12 died out, my world also fell into a pitch-black paralysis. I was roughly dragged by armored hands away from that glass door stained with death, my legs too weak to stand, leaving streaks of blood from my torn hands on the cold concrete floor. They took me to an isolated detention area deep within the base, a small room with cold white lights that never went out. It was the beginning of a continuous and cruel interrogation. For hours, perhaps days, I lost the ability to track time as unfeeling men took turns throwing the same repetitive questions at me like a broken tape recorder. They asked where I saw the creature come from, how fast it moved, and most importantly, whether I had any scratch, drop of fluid, or direct contact with it. That every answer was choked back by sobs. The image of Michael kneeling in the red fire haunted my mind whenever I closed my eyes. My spirit was completely shattered, not by physical torture, but by the ghastly indifference of the system that had ground my brother to ash in an instant without a word. In my most exhausted state, Supervisor Harrison appeared. He walked into the room with a face as rigid as stone, bringing no compassion or comfort for the man who had just lost his only relative. Harrison stood there, looking down at me with soulless eyes, and began coldly hammering into my head the ruthless terms of rule number 5, the rule of absolute silence that I had once thought was obvious. He reminded me in a mechanical tone that if anyone asked about Area 51, my only answer must be a smile and an assertion that the place was not real. His words were like nails driven into the coffin of my soul, forcing me to accept a false reality to protect the bloody secret they hid beneath the desert floor. Harrison did not stop there. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of cold metal, and imposed a cruel command, a heart-wrenching lie. He ordered that I must tell my family mother, who was waiting at home, that Michael had died in a traffic accident outside the base, not in this hellhole. They wanted me to personally erase my brother's heroic sacrifice, turning a death for the sake of kin into a meaningless roadside accident, just to keep the name of Area 51 shrouded in blind denial. I looked at Harrison, wanting to scream that they were the real monsters, but no sound could escape my chest, which was tightening with hatred and grief. In that white room, I realized I was no longer a free man. I had become a prisoner of lies, a machine that had to learn to smile and lie according to a script written by those who had stolen everything I loved. I left the underground base that night, carrying a dead soul in hands that still trembled violently on the steering wheel, driving in a state of madness toward my mother's house. I drove continuously without rest or sleep, unable to even stop to breathe, for my mind was a bottomless black hole holding the image of Michael vanishing in the fire. When I stepped into the familiar family kitchen, everything was as it had been for decades. The smell of coffee came from the old machine, the radio crackled with mundane news, and my mother, Eleanor, was busy at the stove as if following an endless habit. She turned to look at me, and with just one glance at my haggard face and eyes red with resentment, she recognized that something horrific had happened and asked, trembling, what had come to pass. I quietly told her to sit in the familiar wooden chair, my heart breaking as I faced her eyes filled with worry and absolute trust. Haunted by the organization's ghost and with Harrison's cold threats still hammering in my ears, I was forced to swallow my tears and utter a lie that tore my heart apart. I told her there had been an accident at work, a terrible traffic accident outside the base as we were moving between areas, and that Michael had not survived. I had to lie to her about his heroic sacrifice, stripping away the truth of a brother who gave his life to save mine, replacing it with a mundane and bland story of a street accident. Then why mother did not ask for further details. She did not scream, but only quietly bowed her head into her thin hands and sobbed with a painful rhythm. After a long time, she wiped her tears and softly asked when it happened. I could only nod blankly in confirmation, and then we both fell into a deathly silence. The sight of my mother collapsing in grief while I had to keep absolute silence about what truly happened created a tormenting guilt, a misery that made me feel more disgusting than those green-blooded creatures. I did not even dare to look into her swollen eyes, fearing the horrifying truth would burst out of my chest. I sat there like a criminal serving the very people who had killed my brother, feeling every cell in my body being devoured by cowardice and lies. Every sob from my mother was like a knife in my heart, reminding me that the price of the life Michael gave me was an existence based on a loathsome lie. We sat there all night in the terrifying silence of the kitchen, where the truth of an anomalous world and Michael's sacrifice was forever buried under the cover of a traffic accident. The next morning, as I dragged my exhausted body back to the hellhole of Area 51, another horrific truth struck me, more ruthless than my brother's death. I passed through the familiar security checkpoints, breathing the bland, sterile air that had been part of our lives for 15 years, but the feeling of Michael's presence had vanished like smoke in the wind. When I went to find the shift board and the personnel list for the recovery department, my eyes blurred with horror. Michael Vance's name had been completely scrubbed from every system as if he had never existed on this earth. I frantically searched old records and logs we had both signed for thousands of days, but everything had been subtly edited, replaced by a soulless blank space or the name of some stranger I had never heard of. 15 years of service, 15 years of trading youth and safety to protect the organization's darkest secrets, and yet my brother's existence was now considered nothing more than a system error that needed to be erased without a trace to preserve the grand lie. I ran to the locker room, hoping to find some small possession photo or an old jacket, but all I found was an empty steel locker, cleaned and bearing a new name tag for a transferred employee. I felt like I was going insane, as if my own memories were betraying me, but the stinging pain in my heart and the wounds on my hands reminded me that Michael was real. I went to see my direct supervisor, hoping for an explanation or at least a recognition of his sacrifice, but his indifference extinguished every spark of hope. He did not even look up from the soulless papers on his desk. His face remained as rigid as a stone mask when I spoke my brother's name in despair. His answer was merely that I had handled everything correctly and that was all the organization required of me. He then ordered me back to my post without permission for further questions. There were no condolences and no recognition that Michael had given his life to save another employee. There was only an unspoken command that Michael was dead and I must play my part if I wanted to keep my own life. From that moment, my life became a series of long, dark days where I lived like a soulless shadow in cold steel hallways. I repeated the lie about the traffic accident to anyone who accidentally asked about Michael, and each time I spoke those words, my soul was crushed by self-loathing. I looked in the mirror and saw only a stranger with empty eyes, someone breathing the air of the people who had killed his brother for the sake of a shameful existence. I became part of this grand secret system, a silent machine that smiled and denied reality according to rule number 5, while inside was an unresolvable abyss of rage and grief. Every step in the base reminded me of Michael and how his noble sacrifice was buried under concrete and professional lies. I lived like a walking corpse, performing shifts emotionlessly, moving cargo and cleaning anomalous traces without curiosity or fear, because the greatest fear had already consumed me. My existence was now merely a simulation of life, a cowardly flight under the shell of a model employee, making me slowly forget who I was before Area 51 strangled the last warmth of my family. I existed among ghosts in a distorted reality, where truth was considered a sin and loyalty was built on nameless graves. Every night, facing my mother's silence, I felt the iron cage of lies closing in, choking my heart until I could not distinguish between dreams and a cruel reality. I endured that long silence finally reached its limit when the last drop caused the cup to overflow, and the suppressed pain and rage burst out like a flood that could not be stopped. I realized I could no longer live as a shadow in this ruthless, unfeeling machine. Michael was not just a colleague or a payroll number or an erased file. He was my brother who gave his life so I could breathe the air of this world. My long silence was not compliance but a disgusting betrayal of his sacrifice, and I could not let his soul be buried in lies for another second. In this moment, I decided to cast away rule number 5 entirely, discarding the fake smile and the cowardly denial of Area 51 that I will say everything. I will return and tell my mother the truth of Michael's bravery instead of that fake accident. I will find a way for the whole world to know about the souls buried under the desert sand and the bloody secrets this organization hides. The truth might take my fragile life, but at least I will die as a human with a soul and dignity, rather than a silent machine serving dark powers beneath the ground. The story of David Vance is not just a warning about the dark secrets of powerful organizations, but a deep lesson on human values and the undying strength of family bonds. It reminds us that in any cruel circumstance, honesty with oneself and compassion between humans are the only lights leading us out of the darkness of lies and indifference. Sometimes the price of truth is high, but the price of living in falsehood is far higher as it gradually devours the humanity within us. If you feel this story has touched your emotions or prompted deep thoughts on honesty, please subscribe to our channel, like, and share this video. We truly wish to know how you feel about this story and if you have ever seen hidden truths in the life around you. Please share your comments and feelings from your heart because we always value and listen to our audience. Finally, we wish you good health and a life full of joy and peace of mind. Thank you for accompanying us, goodbye, and see you in the next video.